The outlaw carried his brother's boots into town, the leather still stained with the dust of the grave he'd dug himself. He'd come for whiskey, but the first face he saw was a mirror of his own sorrow, a widow whose eyes held a question he could never answer. The desert had baked the sin right into Silas Morgan's skin. He could feel it, a gritty film of shame and sand that no amount of wind would ever scour clean. He rode into the town of Mercy, Arizona, with the slow, defeated cadence of a man who knew he didn't deserve a destination. The sun was a merciless brass bell overhead, hammering the world into silence and submission. The only sounds were the weary creak of his saddle, the slow, plodding footfalls of his horse, and the soft, maddening tap of the pair of boots tied behind him. They were good boots, worn but sturdy, the soles barely thinning. They belonged to Elijah. Every tap against the horse's flank was an accusation. Murderer, brother, killer. The fight played on a loop behind his eyes, a flickering nightmare in the relentless daylight. It hadn't been about the money, not really. It had been about the look on Elijah's face, that charming, reckless grin that had talked them into and out of 100 troubles. But this time, the trouble was too deep. A debt owed to men who collected in blood, not coin. The argument under that vast, star-choked sky, the scent of juniper wood smoke and cheap whiskey hanging between them. Elijah's hand, flashing toward his own pistol not in earnest, but in theatrical frustration. The sudden, shocking roar of Silas's Colt, exploding the silence of the midnight desert. The way the grin had vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed shock that would be the last expression his brother ever made. He'd buried him there, in the cool sand, under a stone cairn. He'd taken the boots because it was a waste to leave good leather to the worms. The act felt practical in his grief-stricken haze. Now, it felt like a sacrilege. Mercy was a town built on dust and desperation. A single wide street of battered wooden buildings, their paint long since sandblasted away to reveal the gray, weary grain beneath. The air smelled of hot timber, horse dung, and the faint, metallic tang of the played-out silver mine that crouched on the edge of town like a skeletal beast. A dog slept in a patch of shade, twitching at flies. An old man on a porch rocked slowly, his eyes tracking Silas with the dull curiosity of a vulture. Silas dismounted outside a saloon called The Last Chance, his boots, his own boots, kicking up little puffs of pale dust. His throat was a raw, closed-up tunnel. He needed a drink. He needed a dozen drinks, enough to blur the sharp edges of the memory, to drown out the sound of that single gunshot that still rang in his ears. He tied his horse to the rail, his fingers fumbling on the knot. As he turned, his gaze swept across the street and landed on a woman. She was hanging washing on a line behind a small, run-down adobe house, her movements slow, weighted by a profound exhaustion that was more than physical. She wore a faded black dress, the color of mourning, worn thin at the elbows and hem. Her hair, the color of dark wheat, was pulled back in a severe bun, but strands of it had escaped to curl damply against her neck in the heat. She wasn't old, but her youth had been leached away by hardship. Her face was pale and finely drawn, but it was her eyes that stopped him dead. They were the color of a winter sky, and they held a depth of sorrow so vast and still that it felt like looking into a deep, cold well. She felt his stare and looked up. For a long moment, their eyes held across the dusty expanse of the street. In her gaze, he saw no curiosity, no fear, just a quiet, resigned acknowledgement of another soul passing through this purgatory. She looked down again, resuming her work, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the wet sheet she was hanging was more than she could bear. Her sorrow was a mirror, and in it, Silas saw the grotesque reflection of his own. Guilt. He had killed in a hot, violent instant. Her pain was a slow, grinding attrition, yet they were kin in their grief. The connection was immediate, irrational, and it unnerved him more than any sheriff's posse ever could. He pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon, leaving the blinding white heat for the dim, beer-soaked gloom inside. The place was empty save for a barkeep polishing a glass with a dirty rag. The air was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and spilled whiskey. "Whiskey," Silas rasped, slapping a coin on the bar. "Leave the bottle." The barkeep, a thin man with a tired mustache, set a bottle and a glass before him. His eyes flickered to the dust caked on Silas's clothes, to the haunted look in his eyes. "Passing through." Silas didn't answer. He poured the whiskey with a hand that trembled only slightly and threw it back. The liquor burned its way down his parched throat, but it didn't warm him. It just felt like pouring oil on a fire that was already burning him up from the inside. He poured another. "Who's the woman?" The question was out of his mouth before he could stop it, rough and low. The barkeep followed his gaze out the window to the small adobe house. "That'd be Clara Yates, widow woman. Husband was a miner. The Silver King mine collapsed 6 months back. He was in it." He said it with the flat tone of a man reciting a well-known fact of nature, like a drought or a flash flood. "Tough luck. She's trying to keep his little ranch going alone. Ain't doing too well." Silas stared at the amber liquid in his glass. A widow. Of course she was. He had ridden into a town called Mercy and found a woman whose life was a monument to loss, just like his. He took another drink, the image of her weary, beautiful face superimposing itself over the memory of his brother's dying eyes. The whiskey had lost all taste. It was just fuel for the torment. He paid for the bottle, shoved it into his saddlebag, and mounted up. He meant to ride straight out of town, to leave this place and its haunting mirror behind. But as he turned his horse, his eyes were drawn again to Clara Yates's small ranch on the edge of town. The fence was broken in a dozen places. The roof of the barn sagged like a tired back. It was a losing battle, a battle against the land, against fate, against the crushing weight of solitude. He saw the boots tied to his saddle. Good, sturdy boots. Boots meant for walking, for working, for building, not for lying forgotten in a desert grave. And in that moment, Silas Morgan, the drifter, the killer, did not ride west out of town. He turned his horse and nudged it slowly toward the broken fence line, drawn toward the widow's sorrow like a moth to a flame that promised not just heat, but annihilation. He offered to mend her fence for a meal, his hands aching for honest work instead of the feel of a gun. But in the quiet of her home, he saw the portrait of her dead husband, a man who wore his brother's same smiling, reckless face. The next morning, Silas found himself at the edge of Clara Yates's property, the broken-down fence stretching before him like a challenge. He'd slept fitfully in the lee of her barn, the bottle of whiskey doing little to quiet the ghosts that rode with him. The dawn was cold and clear, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. Dew clung to the sparse, yellow grass, and the air held the clean, brittle scent of the desert before the sun began to bake it. He worked without being asked. It was a penance. He found a rusty hammer and a few nails in the barn, and he set to work on the fence, pulling up the splintered posts and setting new ones he hacked from a stand of juniper. The physical labor was a brutal blessing. It burned the whiskey fog from his brain and replaced the echoing gunshot in his mind with the satisfying thud of the hammer and the strain of his muscles. His blistered hands, the sweat tracing lines through the dust on his face, it all felt real. It felt like something a man who wasn't damned might do. He felt her watching him long before she spoke. He could sense her presence from the slight shift in the air, the way the birdsong from the nearby mesquite tree momentarily stilled. He kept his head down, driving a nail into a warped board. "I can't pay you." Her voice was quiet, but it carried clearly in the morning stillness. It wasn't unfriendly, just stated as a simple, immutable fact. Silas straightened up, wiping his forearm across his brow. She stood a dozen yards away, holding a chipped enamel cup of water. Her morning dress was covered by a faded apron, and she looked even younger in the sharp morning light, the shadows under her eyes more pronounced. "Didn't ask for pay," he said, his own voice rough from disuse and dust. "Then why?" she asked. There was no suspicion in her tone, only a weary curiosity. Why would anyone do anything without immediate gain? He looked away, toward the vast, empty expanse of desert beyond her land. Saw the work needed doing. My horse needed a day's rest. A meal would be settlement enough. It was a lie, or at least only a sliver of the truth, but it was a practical one. It was a reason a drifting man might have. She considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. I can manage a meal. She took a few steps forward and held out the cup. Water first. The gesture was so simple, so fundamentally decent, that it lodged in his throat like a stone. He took the cup, his calloused fingers brushing against hers for the briefest second. Her skin was warm. He drank the water, and it was the sweetest, coldest thing he had ever tasted. It wasn't just water. It was an offering, a tiny thread of connection. He went back to work. She disappeared into the small house and returned later with a plate of beans and a piece of cornbread. He ate it sitting on the ground, his back against a new fence post, and she sat on the porch step, mending a tear in a work shirt. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had been alone with their thoughts for so long that the presence of another person was a quiet novelty, not a burden. Later, when the worst of the fence was mended and the sun was high, she invited him inside to share the evening stew. The inside of the adobe was clean, but poor. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a cold fireplace. The air smelled of soap and simmering beans. And on the wall, next to a small, neatly made bed, was a portrait. It was a small, hand-tinted photograph in a simple wooden frame. A man and a woman, standing stiffly side by side. Clara, looking younger, her eyes bright with a hope that had since been extinguished. And beside her, his arm around her waist, was her husband. Silas's breath caught in his chest. The man had a strong, kind face, clean shaven and smiling. But it was the eyes that held Silas frozen. They had a light in them, a playful, reckless spark. It was a different face, a kinder face than Elijah's, but the spirit behind the eyes was identical. The same easy confidence, the same unshakable belief that the world was an adventure designed specifically for him. This was the man Clara had loved. This was the man whose loss had carved such deep lines of sorrow into her face. Seeing that echo of his brother's soul in this sacred space felt like a violation, a cruel joke from a malicious god. "That's Thomas," Clara said softly, following his gaze. She was stirring the pot over the fire, her back to him. He was full of life, always laughing. Said he'd strike it rich in that mine and build me a palace right here. She gave a soft, sad sound that was almost a laugh. He found enough silver to buy me that frame. Silas couldn't speak. He could only stare at the portrait, at the ghost of his brother's smile on another man's face. The stew was simple, just beans and a little salt pork, but it was hot and filling. They ate at the small table, the light from the single oil lamp painting their faces in golden shadow. He told her his name was Sam. Sam Gyons. The lie tasted like ash. He told her he was from back east, looking for work. She spoke of Thomas, of the mine collapse, of the long, lonely months that had followed. She spoke not with self-pity, but with a stark honesty that was more devastating than any tears could have been. "The bankman came last week," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She stared in her empty bowl. Said if I can't bring in the harvest, if I can't prove the ranch is viable, he'll take it. It's all I have left of him. The vulnerability in her work, watching for these things, storing them away. He, who had known only the companionship of rough men and the lonely howl of the wind, was learning the quiet grammar of a woman's world. It was the most beautiful and the most terrifying thing he had ever known. One afternoon, a grizzled old man with a face like worn saddle leather and a permanent squint came ambling up the dirt path to the ranch. He tipped his battered hat to Clara. "Mrs. Yates." "Mr. Holloway," Clara said, wiping her hands on her apron. "This is Sam. He's helping me get things in order." The old man, Holloway, turned his squint on Silas. His eyes were pale and milky blue, but they missed nothing. They took in Silas's posture, the way he held the hammer, the dust ground into his clothes. "Sam," he grunted by way of greeting, "saw you working. Good to see this place getting some care. Thomas was a good man. Didn't deserve what happened in that godforsaken hole." Silas gave a tight nod, his throat suddenly dry. The mention of Thomas, of the mine, always sent a cold trickle of dread down his spine. Holloway turned back to Clara, discussing a piece of harness he was going to mend for her. As he talked, his eyes drifted past her, back to Silas. There was a long, appraising pause. "You put me in mind of a fella," Holloway said, his tone casual, conversational. "Seen him a time or two for the collapse. Fella had a look about him. Same, I dunno, same way of standing. Same kind of quiet. Had a smile on him, though. Charmed the petticoats off the girls at the last chance, and the coins out of the men's pockets at the poker table." Silas's heart gave a single, hard thud against his ribs. He kept his face a careful blank, driving a nail into a new post for the corral. The thwack of the hammer was unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "What was his name?" Clara asked, politely interested. Holloway chewed on the inside of his cheek, thinking, "Morgan, I think it was. Yeah, Elijah Morgan. That was it. Talked about a brother once, back in Texas." "You ain't from Texas, are you, Sam?" The world did not stop. The sun still shone. A horsefly buzzed near Silas's ear. But for him, everything constricted to the old man's squinting eyes and the name that had just fallen from his lips like a drop of poison. Elijah Morgan. It was the sound of a coffin lid slamming shut. Silas forced himself to shake his head, to keep his movements slow and deliberate. "No, sir," he said, his voice sounding like it came from the bottom of a deep well. "Ohio." Holloway held his gaze for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Must have been my mistake. Lots of men pass through." He tipped his hat again to Clara. "I'll have that harness for you directly, ma'am." He ambled away, leaving a silence behind him that was thick and heavy as wool. Clara turned to Silas, a faint, curious frown on her face. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Sam." He forced a smile, a weak, twitching thing that felt like a death rictus on his face. "The sun," he mumbled. "Just a touch of the sun." He picked up his canteen and drank, but the water tasted of dust and fear. The rest of the day passed in a nightmare haze. Every sound was Holloway's voice. Every shadow held the ghost of his brother's grinning face. The lie, which had felt like a protective shell, now felt like a glass box, and he was trapped inside, waiting for someone to shatter it. Holloway knew, maybe not the truth, but he knew the name. He knew the face. It was only a matter of time before the pieces connected in his mind. That night, sleep was impossible. The walls of the small barn felt like they were closing in on him. The name Elijah Morgan echoed in his skull. He rose from his bedroll and slipped outside into the cool, silvered light of a half-moon. The town of Mercy was asleep. The desert was utterly silent. And there, on the edge of town, stood the dark, hulking silhouette of the Silver King mine. The main shaft was boarded up, a crude cross nailed over. The entrance where men had been entombed. It was a place of death and loss, a monument to a tragedy that had stolen Clara's happiness. He found himself walking toward it, pulled by a morbid gravity. The tall, skeletal head frame stood against the starry sky like a gallows. The wind whistled through the loose boards, a low, mournful sound. The air here was still tainted with the smell of cold rock and old despair. He stood before the boarded-up entrance, this grave for many men, and he thought of the grave he had dug for one, a lonely, unmarked patch of desert under a juniper tree. 2 graves, one for the man Clara had loved, one for the man Silas had killed. Both had stolen futures. Both had created the aching emptiness that now defined his life and hers. He had come to this town to outrun his past, but the past was here waiting for him. It was in a widow's sorrow, in an old miner's memory, and in the dark, silent maw of a played-out mine. He was not Sam Jones, the helpful drifter. He was Silas Morgan, the brother killer, and his presence in this place of grief was a second, ongoing violation. The truth was a ticking bomb, and the sound of its timer was now the only thing he could hear, ticking away in the dreadful silence of the night. The cattle baron's men came at noon, but it was the old miner's words in the barn that truly cornered him. And as a dust storm swallowed the world outside, the drifter realized some sins were too big to be buried by desert sand. The threat arrived on horseback, not with a whisper, but with the arrogant thunder of hooves and the jingle of tack. Silas was repairing the hinge on the corral gate when he saw them. 5 riders, kicking up a plume of dust as they turned off the main trail and headed straight for Clara's ranch. They were led by a broad-shouldered man on a sleek bay gelding, his clothes too fine for a working ranch, a silver-chased rifle in his scabbard. Caleb, the cattle baron. Silas didn't need to be told. He knew the look of a man who thought he owned the world and everyone in it. Clara came out onto the porch, her hand shielding her eyes from the sun, her body tense. Silas set down his tools and walked slowly to stand at the bottom of the porch steps, placing himself between her and the newcomers. Caleb reined in his horse, his men fanning out behind him. He didn't bother with greetings. His eyes, small and dark like a pig's, scanned the repaired fence, the mended roof, and finally landed on Silas with dismissive contempt. "Afternoon, Mrs. Yates," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. "See, you've hired yourself some help. That's good. Means you might actually get this place in some kind of order before you leave." "I'm not leaving, Mr. Caleb," Clara said, her voice steady but thin. "Now, we've been over this," Caleb said, as if explaining something to a simple child. "Your spread's got the only reliable water for 10 miles. My cattle are thirsty. You can't work this land alone, and whatever this," he waved a gloved hand at Silas, "is, he ain't going to change that. The bank's going to take it, and I'm going to buy it. Save us all the trouble. I'm offering you a fair price for the deed now. Save you the embarrassment of being run off." "The answer is no," Clara said, her knuckles white where she gripped the porch rail. One of Caleb's men, a lean, cruel-faced man with a long scar down his cheek, spat into the dust. "Ain't no call to be rude to the boss, lady." Silas had remained still, his head slightly bowed, playing the part of the simple hired hand. But the man's tone, his head came up. His eyes, cold and flat, locked onto the scarred man. "The lady gave her answer," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying a whiplash intensity that silenced the jingling of bits and the snorting of horses. The atmosphere shifted. This wasn't a farmhand. This was something else. Caleb's eyes narrowed, reassessing the silent man on the ground. "You got a name, friend?" "Sam," Silas said, the lie feeling thinner than ever. "Well, Sam," Caleb drawled, leaning forward in his saddle, "this is business between me and the widow. You be wise to step aside." The scarred man, eager to please, nudged his horse forward a step, crowding Silas. "You heard the man. Move along." It happened in a blur. The man's hand dropped toward the pistol at his hip. It was a gesture of intimidation, not genuine intent to draw. But Silas's reflexes were honed in a harder school. His own hand flashed, a movement so fast it was almost invisible. His Colt was out and leveled at the man's chest before the man's fingers even touched his own grip. The click of the hammer being cocked was deafening in the sudden, absolute silence. No one moved. The scar man froze, his eyes wide with shock. Caleb's men stared, their hands well away from their own weapons. Silas held the gun, his arm rock steady, his gaze unwavering. In that moment, the drifter was gone, replaced by the killer, the man who knew the precise value of a life and the exact pressure needed on a trigger to end it. Clara gasped a small, horrified sound. Caleb looked from the gun to Silas's face, and a slow, understanding smile spread across his features. It wasn't a friendly smile. Well, he murmured. "Ain't you full of surprises?" He knew he was outgunned, for now. He raised a hand. "Easy, boys. No call for that." Yet, his eyes promised this wasn't over. He tipped his hat to Clara. "You think on my offer, Mrs. Yates? I'll be back." They wheeled their horses and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a terrible, ringing silence behind them. Silas slowly lowered the hammer on his Colt and slid it back into its holster. His heart was pounding, not from fear, but from the old, familiar adrenaline of violence. He turned to look at Clara. She was staring at him, her face pale, her hand over her mouth. The look in her eyes wasn't gratitude. It was fear, slightly. She's been through enough. She don't need a liar and whatever you are, bringing more trouble down on her. Those men Caleb's got, they just hired muscle. The ones looking for you and your brother, they're a different breed. So who are you, son? And what really happened to Elijah Morgan? The truth was a weight too heavy to carry alone anymore. It was in the howling wind, in the old man's knowing eyes, in the memory of the fear on Clara's face. The storm had trapped them all inside, and there was nowhere left for the lie to hide. Silas turned around. The carefully constructed wall of Sam Jones crumbled away, leaving only raw, exposed pain. He looked at the old man, and his voice, when it finally came, was broken by the wind and the weight of his confession. "He's dead," Silas said, the words torn from him. "I buried him." The storm screamed its approval. The truth was out, and it was only the beginning of the devastation. He told her everything: the debt, the argument, the accidental shot that killed his own brother. He waited for her hatred, her screams. But the widow just looked at him with a sorrow deeper than anger, and spoke the words that would haunt him forever. The storm broke near dawn. The hellish, screaming wind gradually faded to a fitful moan, then to an eerie, absolute silence. The world outside the barn was gone, buried under a fine, red dust that lay in smooth, sculpted drifts against the buildings and fences. The sky was a strange, washed-out orange, and the sun, when it finally peered over the horizon, was a pale, bleached coin behind the lingering haze. It was a world newborn and utterly still, every sound muffled, every sin covered in a layer of powder-fine earth. Inside the barn, the air was thick with dust and the aftermath of confession. Silas had told Holloway everything. The gambling debt to men who collected in blood. The frantic flight across the territory. The terrible, final argument under the cold desert stars. The way Elijah had reached for his gun, not to kill, but in a gesture of furious, theatrical frustration. The accidental discharge. The shock. The silence that was louder than the gunshot. The grave dug with bare, bleeding hands. The boots taken as some pathetic, practical memorial. He had spoken in a flat, dead monotone, all the emotion burned out of him, leaving only the stark, ugly facts. Holloway had listened in silence, his grizzled face unreadable. When Silas finished, the old man simply nodded, spat into the dust on the floor, and said, "Well, damn." There was no condemnation in his voice, only a weary acceptance of the terrible ways men could break. "She deserves to hear it from you," he'd said finally. "Not from Caleb, not from me. You owe her that much. I'll see to my own place." And he had slipped out into the fading storm, leaving Silas alone with the crushing weight of what he had to do. Now, in the terrible, dust-coated silence of a new day, Silas walked toward Clara's house. His boots made no sound in the deep powder. He felt hollowed out, a shell waiting to be shattered. He had killed the man she loved in spirit, and now he was about to kill the man she thought he was. He pushed open her door. She was standing by the cold fireplace, already dressed. She had spent the night listening to the world tear itself apart, and it showed in the new lines of tension around her eyes. But when she saw him, some of the fear from the day before melted away, replaced by concern. "Sam, are you all right?" "The storm. I was worried." The name Sam was a knife twist. He closed the door behind him, leaning against it because he wasn't sure his legs would hold him. The small room was filled with the pale, dusty light, illuminating the portrait of Thomas on the wall, the man with his brother's spirit. "My name isn't Sam," he said. His voice was raw, scraped clean. She frowned, confused. "What?" "It's Silas. Silas Morgan." He forced himself to look at her, to see the exact moment. The trust in her eyes began to fracture. He told her. He told her everything, just as he had told Holloway. He didn't soften it, didn't try to make himself the hero of the tragedy. He was the villain, the fool, the agent of his own and everyone else's destruction. He told her about the man Holloway had recognized, about the debt, and finally, about the midnight gunshot that had ended his brother's life and his own. He watched the emotions play across her face like shadows. Confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally, a pain so profound it seemed to physically shrink her. She sank onto the edge of her bed, her hands limp in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing. When he finished, the silence in the room was heavier than the dust outside. He waited for the explosion, for her to scream, to curse his name, to grab the rifle from above the fireplace, and order him out or shoot him where he stood. He would have welcomed it. it would have been a cleaner pain. Instead, she spoke, and her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear it. The man in the portrait, my Thomas, he was like that, so full of light. It could be reckless. It could be foolish. But it was life. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were filled with a bottomless, weary sadness. You didn't just kill your brother, did you? You killed that light. And then you came here, and you found me. Her words weren't accusations. They were realizations. She was piecing together the horrific, cosmic joke of it all. I didn't know, he whispered, the words a plea for an understanding he knew he could never receive. I just saw a broken fence. I just saw someone who hurt like I did. And I offered you my heart for mending it, she said, a single tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. I swore to love you. She looked at him then, truly looked at him. She saw the drifter, the killer, the liar. But she also saw the man who had worked himself to exhaustion under the blazing sun for her. The man who had stood between her and Caleb's men. The man whose eyes held a guilt so massive it threatened to swallow him whole. Her love for Sam wasn't a switch she could turn off. It had become intertwined with her gratitude, her loneliness, her desperate need for salvation. It had become something else entirely. Her promise in this very room had been to love the man who saved her land. And he had. But the man was also the man who had killed a spirit identical to the one she had adored. The conflict tore her apart. There was no hatred in her eyes. There was only a devastating, impossible sorrow. A recognition of a tragedy too vast for anger. You have to go, she said, her voice breaking. You have to go, and you can never come back. It was the sentence he had expected, the only one that made sense. He nodded, his own vision blurring. He turned to leave, to walk back into the desert that had forged him and damned him. Silas. He stopped, his hand on the door latch, but he couldn't bring himself to turn and look at her. Her voice was soft, filled with a heartbreaking finality. I will love you forever. I swore it, and I keep my promises. The words were not a blessing. They were a curse, a life sentence. She would love the ghost of the man she thought he was, and he would forever love the woman whose world he had irrevocably shattered. They would be bound together for the rest of their days by a promise born of a lie and sealed with a truth that could only cause pain. He stumbled out of the house into the strange, dust-blanketed world. He saddled his horse with numb hands, the pair of Elijah's boots a grotesque weight on his saddle. He did not look back. He rode out of mercy, leaving the widow and her saved land behind. The town's name was the cruelest joke of all. There was no mercy for him. Not in the desert, not in the bottle, not in the empty expanse of his future. The only thing that would remain was the echo of a widow's vow, a love as vast and unforgiving as the desert itself, following him like a shadow for the rest of his lonely, endless days. He was a drifter again, but now he carried a new weight, heavier than any brother's boots. He carried the memory of a love he could never have, given to him by a woman he could never see again, for a crime that could never, ever be undone. The sun rose higher, bleaching the color from the world, and Silas Morgan rode on, into the silence, into the dust, into forever.